Arc 6, The Corridor of Memories. Chapter 21, The Monolith Challenge. Regarding Shala's welcoming words, while Subaru did understand that they'd been misdirected to a different person, he decided that he'd receive them without denying them in the end. There was also Beatrice's advice. There was no doubt that in practicality allowing Shala to mistake Subaru as Flugel was rather convenient for them. With this in place now, it meant that an outcome where Shala became hostile and commenced battle wouldn't necessarily end up in them being scattered about by her overwhelming strength. Since she was treating them favorably for now, Subaru could at least dull in his hand of attack. Though if he were to do that, considering that he lacked in actual strength even under the best of circumstances, it'd probably be enough to end up as a main factor in him making a colossal blunder. Emilia, you needn't worry, Subaru. Even if Shala realizes that in truth you're not her master, I'm sure she wouldn't do anything awful. Those were Emilia's words, who seemed to have been eavesdropping on their conversation behind them. Emilia, who had her silver hair styled in long braids, confidently assured that to Subaru, whilst she fiddled with the end of one of her braids with her fingers. Subaru, I'm glad of Emilia-tan's seal of approval, but what's the rationale behind it? Emilia, I don't really fully understand what you mean by the expression what's the rationale behind it, but Shala's a good girl, isn't she? She saved you, and us as well, so I can say that we will all get along. If we do, there shouldn't be any need to fight, right? Subaru, right. Her opinion was a little too optimistic, but he could say that being too pessimistic was also enough of a bad habit. Even if Shala found out the truth, it didn't mean that she'd get aggressive straight away. Even if the facts came to light, Shala should keep herself from coming to blows at her own judgment. So, Emilia's thoughts that they should all get along weren't so misguided, at least he could allow himself to think so. The reason behind that intent wasn't a calculating goal like appealing to one's emotions, but rather because he didn't want to fight against her. Ram, don't take Emilia's rough ideas word for word, Barosu. We're in the Sage's watchtower here, and we need to challenge it to even make our way back to the sand dunes. We lose nothing by keeping our guards up as much as possible. Emilia, geez, you sure were quick to put it like that, Ram. You should really loosen up a little. Ram, the result of having let down my guard was that I ended up being thrown down to the underground area with Barosu and Anastasia-sama. With how delicate I am, that feeling of despair was unbearable. Perhaps that's why, Emilia-sama, you have no clue about that. Emilia, I guess so. But surely if it's an underground area around this place you're talking about, then shouldn't it be no big deal for you? I don't know why, but I've been in really good shape since coming to the Augria sand dunes, you know? It seemed like Emilia had replied to the sharp Ram's words in a rather relaxed manner. Emilia and Ram's relationship as master and vassal had been pretty good since a year ago. The way Ram spoke and behaved towards Emilia showed a little lack of respect, but Emilia looked like she couldn't help but be happy receiving that treatment. Emilia, who should have experienced the trauma of discrimination and contempt, may have contrarily felt that Ram's words didn't contain that sort of animosity. Subaru, at any rate, Emilia-tan, what do you mean by you being in good shape? Emilia, how should I put it, the air goes well with my skin, I guess. Manitou has a slightly different tone to it depending on the country or region you're in, so I think something like that's happening, but the mana in this place especially seems to go well with my skin. Though I guess I shouldn't be very happy about that. Subaru, well, I suppose so. But considering that this is the place where the witch is sealed, full of these witch beasts. Emilia had clenched her fist as if she'd felt a surge of strength go through her. However, straight after, a bitter-looking smile appeared on her dismal-looking face. Her opinion had been an emboldened one, for sure, as he sympathized with the mood she was in. Following what he'd mentioned above, he was silently grateful that Emilia's strength had grown in this area they were in, which was chock full of danger with the witch and the witch beasts. Yet even so, the figure which Shala had defeated had been engraved in Subaru's mind, so that wasn't a reason that could end up giving him some optimism. Subaru though, the conditions have changed. Unlike before where she could attack us from the tower without us being able to do anything, now that the distance is such that you can see each other's faces, Emilia-tan shouldn't end up losing against her. Shala, what is it? What is it? Subaru, nothing, was just talking about how you have crazy good eyesight. You managed to throw attacks at us from the tower with pinpoint accuracy when we were really far off, didn't you? How the hell does that work? Shala, oh, that's just done by linking MYYYYY aim and MYYYY stingers with mana, and that makes it so it's pulled to where you are. Hell's snipe was Master's invention, you know? Subaru, I see, you didn't even have to train her, Flugel. He'd gone through hell and back again thanks to that. He'd probably never get a chance to talk to Flugel, but if he did get a chance like at the tea party, he'd definitely be giving him some very colorful, choice words. Subaru let out a sigh as he heard the upbeat Shala humming. Then, Julius, sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your chat, but we've arrived. Subaru? On the spiral staircase which led to the upper floors of the tower he heard Julius' voice, who'd been at the front of the group, leading them up. Lifting his face up at the knight's words, who was escorting Anastasia by the hand, he could suddenly see the ceiling from the other side of Julius, who was standing diagonally up from him. Subaru, no, it's not the ceiling, but the floor part of the floor above, I should say. Beatrice, we must be on the 5th floor, Celino, I suppose. All there is here is a door to the outside. Betty and the others first entered from here, in fact. Betty, who was next to him, commented that to him just as they neared the 5th floor. As he nodded in agreement to her words, Subaru immediately noticed that something was out of place and said, If she was implying that after they'd been separated, Emilia and the others had entered the tower from the 5th floor, then. Subaru, how did the dragon carriage and Gan get down to the bottom floor? I mean, there's no way that this staircase is wide enough to let a dragon carriage roll by, right? Spreading his arms out across the spiral staircase he'd walked up, Subaru checked its width. The width of the staircase was reasonably wide, but even so it wouldn't fit two Subarus with arms stretched out abreast. It might have been barely possible to let the huge body of an earth dragon pass down it, but there was no way that the carriage part of the dragon carriage was getting through. And of course, letting the earth dragon walk down this long staircase itself was a path which really shouldn't be trodden even if it was theoretically possible. Subaru, is there some sort of contraption like an elevator poking around here in fact? If there is, then we need to use it next time. Keeping healthy is great and all, but it ain't good to always disregard modern conveniences. Emilia, sorry, I don't really get what you're saying. But how the dragon carriage got down there is simple. Shala lifted it up and carried it down. Subaru, pardon? Subaru felt like he'd missed something, and so he asked her again. Emilia frowned at his reply, which had been said in English, but she nevertheless grasped that he seemed to have asked her to repeat herself, so she continued her words by saying so. Emilia, Shala effortlessly lifted the dragon carriage along with the earth dragon up, and simply brought them down to the bottom. Subaru, no, there's no way. Wouldn't a dragon carriage weigh over a ton with how huge it is? And you said she did it as a set with the earth dragon too. Subaru peeled his eyes wide open at those horrifying remarks, but no one from his companions denied it. Finally, Shala puffed out her ample chest in pride and flared out her nostrils. Shala, it's as she said, the one who carried them down was me. Oh man, it was a piece of cake. If I'd left the lizard near the doorway, he may have ended up becoming loopy due to the miasma streaming in from the outside, don't you think? I was just a little worried. You can praise me, you know. Subaru, I do feel grateful, but now I know that your slender arms aren't actually slender arms, and it weirds me out. A person with superhuman strength. I imagine even Reinhardt wouldn't be able to do this. Though in Subaru's mind the most frightfully shocking human was indisputably Reinhardt, but wouldn't it likely be impossible even for him to lift up something that weighed over what you'd expect a human could lift? Even if he could cut the world into ribbons with his sword pressure, even if he could walk on water, even if he could revive himself again, carrying a dragon carriage with one hand for him would be. Subaru, I guess he'd be able to do that. That makes me feel just a bit uneasy. Is that guy really human? Shala, despite MYYYY story, Master's thinking of someone else. Jealousy. In any case, he now understood how the dragon carriage had been carried to the bottommost floor. He hadn't in actuality seen her carrying it, so the impact of the scene was diminished, but he had to take it as a new threat potential in the eventuality that the enraged Shala problem cropped up. And, just as they'd finished talking about that, the group arrived on the 5th floor. Celino, as had been pointed out many times, was where the entrance that led to the inside and outside of the tower was. A huge door was built in one place at the back of the tower, which was cylindrical in shape. It was large enough that you had to look up at it, and its width was easily close to 10 meters. It was an unnecessarily huge door, but how much strength it would take to open it, that too was an issue. Subaru, doesn't it look difficult to enter this via the trial doorway? Julius, at least, when I tried pushing it, it wouldn't give an inch. Thanks to that, we weren't able to search for you, Anastasia-sama, and the others. As he gazed at the super-huge door, Subaru let out a sigh, and Julius nodded at him. With it being as heavy as it looked, it seemed like this door would stop any challengers in their path. Opening it may have been possible for Shala, who could easily carry a dragon carriage in one hand, but for the average Joe it would have been impossible. Therefore Emilia and Julius had ended up being unable to leave to search for Subaru and the others, and that looked like it had ended up worrying them a lot. Beatrice, but it sure does look like it's a bit creaky here and there, I suppose. Anastasia, I think it's 'cause the sand wind's kinda strong, the sand that gets blown up by the wind must be streaming in, don't you think? When you take a bit of a deep breath, it immediately feels like the inside of your mouth is full of sand, and so it's darn unpleasant. Sticking her tongue out, Anastasia traced it with her finger and cleaned some sand grains from it. Just like she had said, the inside of Subaru's mouth too felt like it had sand in it. He'd taken notice that minute grains of sand always whirled around the 5th floor that led to the outside. Julius, the sand from the sand dunes is full of miasma. If you don't take it seriously because you think it's just a small amount, it could end up eating into your body from the inside. We should move away from here as quickly as possible, so long as we have nothing to do here. Subaru, in that case, let's hop to it. My goal isn't here, but rather on the 4th floor Alcyone. Though yet more stairs sounds exhausting. Shala, the same old weakness. But you needn't fret. The staircase between the 4th and 5th floor is way shorter than the one between the 5th and 6th floor. If they were too far apart, even I'd feel tired going back and forth, so that was taken into consideration. Meili, stop shaking me about. Shala, who'd spread her arms out wide inside of the sand cloud and ran about in it, was met with a karate chop to the back of her head from Meili. Looking at that scene from the corner of their eyes, the group went through the 5th floor and headed to the staircase that led up to the 4th floor. The breeze gently streamed in, and through his sight that was clouded over in a yellow haze by the gloomy above, where he looked up, there was a ceiling that didn't look so far away he could see the floor of the floor above, and it looked like her opinion had in fact been true, in that it wasn't too far away. And so, as they set their sights on the 4th floor Alcyone whilst chatting, the group continued to march on upwards, and before long, they reached their target floor. The constitution of the 4th floor itself wasn't too different from the 5th or 6th floor. The cylindrical constitution of the tower hadn't deviated from what it had been, and even its size hadn't changed dramatically. Nevertheless, there was still an obvious change of atmosphere. First of all, the size of the floor that went up the stairs was quite different to that of the lower floors. The circular floor had become much narrower compared to them. And that wasn't too surprising, because a circular wall had been built up as a partition like the main one of the building, and it used the space differently compared to the lower floors, which had just been one big floor with nothing else to them. The spiral staircase from the lower floors had connected straight to the heart of the 4th floor, and a great number of doors were dotted across the wall that encircled the surroundings, indicating that there were multiple rooms on this floor. Shala, this is the 4th floor, Alcyone, that I use as MYYYY dwelling area. And the green room, which I think is what Master came here for, is right here. Subaru, the green room. As Subaru stood in bewilderment looking on at the 4th floor's new look, Shala, who was standing on the floor after having come out after him, pointed out one of the doors in front with an overly dramatic gesture. The doors that were on the 4th floor were all of a normal size compared to the doorway on the 5th floor. It didn't look like they'd need any special powers to open them, but there was a strange feeling floating about the door she had pointed out. Just like the name Green Room implied, the door was covered in countless green ivy, and it had ended up in a state that looked similar to what an unexplored region of a jungle might look like that had been left untouched for centuries. Subaru, by saying this is what you think I came here for, do you mean that REM and Patrash are here? Shala, I don't know their names, but the girl and the lizard are here. Ram, you needn't worry. You can rest assured that REM and that Earth Dragon are inside. For the hesitant Subaru, Shala's testimony felt like it had lacked in reliability just a tad. Ram snorted her nose at them as if looking down at them like idiots, cut into the lead of the group, and headed towards the green room. She stretched out her hand over to the door that was covered in ivy and pushed it, which looked like it was made of stone, without any hesitation. Even with how thin her arms were, the door opened readily as if gliding open, and there from the green room came into view. Ram, aren't you coming in? Barusu. Subaru, I'm coming. Subaru let go of his apprehension when he heard Ram's question, which had felt like she was testing him, and moved forward. Then he confidently entered inside of the green room, following Ram, who'd entered ahead of him. However, straight after Ram and Subaru entered inside, the door slammed shut. Subaru turned to look behind him in surprise. Subaru, oi, we've been split up. Ram, there's no need to be scared. This room seems to have a limit on how many people can enter it. The proprietor of the room seems to hate having more. Ram said that about the debacle that had happened behind them, and Brisky kept on moving forward. Subaru scratched his head at her explanation, and then immediately set out after her. The green room didn't betray the bizarreness of that door. Its interior was covered in a copious amount of green. Wriggling plants stretched out just about everywhere you looked, across the ceiling, the walls, and the floor. Every so often, he would need to stoop down to avoid the dangling ivy that got in his way, and sidestep it. And, laying at the depths of this room dominated by such greenery was Subaru, REM, and Patrash. There was a small plant-free space at the far back of this room immersed in greenery. Green grass grew dense and thick there, and some beds had been made, covered in small flowers that had taken bloom there. REM, her sleeping face ever the same, lay on top of the bed which was made up from greenery and flowers. Her white cheeks hadn't changed in color, and neither had her sleeping face. Her chest was rising and falling with each faint breath, but when it came to proof that she was alive, those were her only vital signs barring the warmth she gave off. Yet even so, he felt a great sense of relief to the point that his strength fizzled out of him. Subaru, she really was safe, huh? Ram, I did tell you so. Or, did you think that I'd lie about REM or something? What meaning would I have in doing that? Subaru, I ain't saying that, but I couldn't help worrying until I saw her with my own eyes, you know. And Patrash, I'm glad that you're safe too. Subaru gave a faint bittersweet smile as he heard Ram's words, and then he walked further in towards where REM was sleeping on her bed of grass and Patrash sat crouched down. She too was lying sprawled on a bed of green, just like REM. The situation wasn't all too different than when she'd lie down on top of her rushes in a barn. However, one thing was definitely different. Subaru, this grass is different to ordinary grass, isn't it? Patrash. Patrash nuzzled her nose against Subaru's palm, who'd stepped over to her to make sure she was alright. Whilst affectionately receiving his beloved dragon's response, Subaru felt a faint surge of warmth coming from the sprawled bed of greenery which Patrash was on. He cocked his head in thought. Ram, it appears like the spirit's power can speed up the healing process. Subaru, there's a spirit here? Where? Ram, you're a spirit user and you don't know? This whole room is the spirit. Subaru. Subaru briskly looked around the room at Ram's words as he stroked Patrash. He couldn't see the spirit's existence reflected in his eyes amongst the moss that grew on the walls or in the overgrown ivy. However, straight after he'd been told that by her, Subaru took notice of the overwhelming amount of mana there was. His breathing and body felt at ease as if he was in an area which was rich in oxygen. There may have been a similar effect to that in the healing mana. Even the uninjured Subaru felt like he was receiving that grace when he relaxed himself and took deep breaths. Subaru, I think I get it. This is the spirit for sure. Can't it talk? Ram, the spirit here is of a different kind. Though, I guess you could easily say that there's no such thing as spirits who don't differ in some capacity. Emilia-sama's esteemed great spirit, and Beatrice-sama, they're special. It doesn't seem like the spirit over here has any sort of volition. It just tries to cure the wounds and illnesses of anyone who enters inside. Subaru, He. Ram, what's the matter? Subaru, it's nothing important. I just thought that sounded like a witch I know of. Ram snorted her nose at that, as if she'd thought hearing the word which was just some nonsense of his, then she walked over to Rem's side. Following that, ivy started to grow right behind her, rapidly knitting itself together until it became a green chair that propped her body up, as if it had been cognizant of the elder sister's intentions to watch over her younger sister. Ram bowed her head in consideration for the spirit and said, I really appreciate it, as she let herself slump on the chair. Subaru, Hoa, awesome. Ram, at least they're certainly the most gentlemanly amongst the spirits I've known up until now, don't you think? You too should follow their example just a tad, Barusu. From both this spirit and that knight Julius. Subaru, I'd rather not from either of them. Subaru drove both of those individuals away from his head and stroked Patrash. He stroked her head and tickled underneath her chin with his palm, before slowly letting her drop her raised head. Subaru, get some rest now. You saved me once again and overworked yourself. There's no drawback in taking some paid leave every once in a while, you know. Patrash. Patrash curled her body up, closed her yellow eyes and fell asleep after she heard Subaru's gentle words. She'd brought them all the way to the tower, and they'd been able to confirm each other's safety. Just that had been plenty, Patrash's work had been plenty. Subaru, any changes to REM? If curing people is this room's raison d'etre, then I wonder if it can have that sort of intervention on how REM is right now. Ram, I'm sorry, but that's a slim hope. It's neither good nor bad. But there's been no progress in her treatment. It can't cure something which is neither a wound or an illness. Seems like that sort of judgment, doesn't it? Subaru, I guess so. Even so, it didn't look like the green room's spirit was unwilling to take care of the still sleeping REM. It was also devoted towards Ram, who watched over the sleeping REM. Subaru, in the end, this means nothing's changed still, doesn't it? Ram, if we want things to change, then we have to fulfill the aim that came up in the tower, don't you think? Subaru, the great library Pleiades, its trials, huh? Their original purpose had been to get in touch with the sage who was in the Pleiades watchtower, borrow her sagacity that had been stipulated to be omniscient, and save REM and the victims of lust and gluttony that they'd left behind in Pristella. However, Shala, the sage of the Pleiades watchtower, had been one in name only, and in actuality what they'd encountered was just one weird girl who'd mistook Subaru as the sage Flugel. The Pleiades watchtower had turned out to be the great library Pleiades, and the knowledge that had been stipulated as Shala's omniscience was sleeping inside countless books that were kept in the libraries, or so had been said. That's right, their purpose had become really distorted, and their end goal had shifted in a direction which they couldn't even predict. Subaru, I'll get a hold of this knowledge and get REM back. I haven't wavered in that purpose. Ram, yeah. So I hope. Ram cast her eyes down at Subaru, rotating his shoulders and nimbly stretching. With that, she tenderly took a hold of the sleeping Ram's hand without glancing at Subaru. Closing one of his eyes at Ram's attitude, Subaru pointed his finger at the ceiling. Subaru, I've decided to challenge the trial above. What about you? Ram, don't you think it'd be too much of a cause for anxiety if no one is looking after REM? Considering that, I will take on that duty. Since from the start it was for watching over REM that I came on this journey, and even went as far as asking such unreasonableness from Roswell-sama. Subaru, well, yeah, I guess so. In that case I'll entrust REM to you. Ram, I can't really do much other than watch her though. Subaru, you watching over has meaning, you know. Saying that to Ram, who had unusually disparaged herself, Subaru looked over at Rem's sleeping face just before he exited the room. She was in a dream where her facial expression had been extinguished, and he couldn't say she looked either peaceful or anguished. He stretched out his hand to her forehead, which her fringe rested against, and gently touched it as if he were tickling her. Subaru, well then, I'm off, I'll see you later. REM. Of course, she didn't reply. Rem understood that he'd been talking to himself as well, so she didn't callously interject. Satisfied with that, Subaru turned towards the room's exit. He couldn't help himself from stretching his hand out to the wall, and as he touched the ivy, he asked the spirit, please take care of REM and Patrash, lest the spirit forget. Then, just before he exited the room, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. Subaru, by the way, you said something like you couldn't leave REM alone, but just now you'd left the room empty. Why did you bother to come downstairs? Ram. Subaru, no way, could it be that when you heard that I'd woken up, you came to see me as quickly as you could? If there was something up, then please let me know. Ram, get a move on and leave. Subaru, huh? No, but if there's something on your mind, then won't you tell me? Ram, hurry up and leave. Overwhelmed by the ghastly aura that was spouting up from her, Subaru couldn't say anything more to her, and thus was left with no choice but to flee from the green room crestfallen. Subaru, I never really get what Ram thinks about, but I especially don't understand her well as of late. Amelia, I don't think so. Ram is surprisingly open with that sort of stuff. I find it cute that she tries to hide that open part of hers. Subaru, it's quite rare for you to speak as if you're her elder. Though I guess you really are her elder. Amelia, yeah, it's a little bit like I'm her big sis. I'm older than anyone else here. Oh wait. Beatrice, Betty is definitely the big sis here, in fact. That's carved in stone and no one can paint over it, I suppose. You should all adore me, in fact. As soon as he'd left the green room, he joined back with everyone waiting outside, which had led to this conversation. Amelia looked a tad frustrated at having had her seat of being the oldest in the team taken away from her, whilst Beatrice puffed out her flat chest in satisfaction. Though, to be honest, neither of them had big sister-like demeanors. Besides, a conversation of who the oldest was in light of their circumstances was in fact quite a delicate matter. Anastasia, Natsuki-kun, what is it? Do ya have something you want to tell me? Subaru, not really. Just meant to say that there's many faces here that don't match their real age and appearance. Anastasia, oh? I get told you look younger than you actually are quite often. It's a little hard for me to take as a compliment, but I look down on being looked down on, so depending how they say it, I may accept it. Though Anastasia smiled with a strong look of business about her face, how she was really feeling was unclear. Anastasia was just over 20 years old, but she looked about 14 or 15. However, what Subaru had wanted to point out wasn't what lay on the outside, but what lay on the inside. Anastasia still had her body hijacked by Iridna currently. If Iridna's birth had been the same as Beatrice, then it wouldn't be difficult for her to enter into the race for the oldest. However, it'd be impossible for him to reveal what he'd concealed up until now over such a trifling matter, so Subaru didn't say anything else. Moreover, there were other prominent candidates for the race for the oldest when confined to the present. Shala, hey, what's up, master? Aha, didn't ya like the grassy smell of the green room? I get that. I too find that room nasty and dislikable. Subaru, didn't you say there was a pungent smell coming from me too? You're cool with mine. Shala, masters is a smell I've gotten used to. Truly. This time it ain't no lie. Subaru, shut your trap. Keeping Shala away from him, who had nestled up close to him and sniffed him, Subaru looked up at the floor above. Those left on the fourth floor would challenge the trial above barring REM and Ram. Subaru, what about you? Are you coming with us? Shala, me? Well, I don't particularly need to, but since it's been so long, I do think I want to come with you. 'Cause it gets lonely not being able to talk despite being perfectly able to. I've been cooped up in silence for centuries, so I want to talk and take. Subaru still couldn't get cold at her with her having said such a heartrending thing with a friendly smile plastered on her face. He imagined that Amelia and Beatrice both knew that sort of loneliness all too well. His feelings towards Shala were deeply tinged with sympathy, so he didn't really have any intentions of actively keeping her away. Meili, I really like this one Isan, so I think she should come with us. Julius, it's only natural that the examiner is present there if we're going to take the trial. It's just for her to accompany us to make sure that we don't commit any irregularities. Support for that came in an unexpected form from Meili and Julius. With them having done so, it meant that the majority of them backed Shala accompanying them. Lastly, Subaru looked over at Anastasia, who hadn't made any comments about it, so to unite their consensus. Receiving that gaze, Anastasia tilted her head and said, "Me? Anastasia, I don't think there's any meaning in just me opposing this here, and I ain't got any reason to oppose it in the first place, and it's not particularly a problem. Besides." Subaru, besides? Anastasia, that girl seems way too attached to Yanatsuki-kun, so if we take her with us, she may tell us stuff about the contents of the trial. She may inadvertently come to our side. Shala, I'm sorry, but I haven't the foggiest about the contents of the trials, so I'm gonna have to let you down there. Subaru, geez, did you really have to say it like that? Anastasia laughed with a tahaha, and Shala looked smug as if she had been praised. It was questionable whether Anastasia's anticipations boded good fortune or bad, but for now, no one seemed to have any objections to Shala accompanying them. Although he couldn't deny that it was a little careless, leaving her alone was also an anxiety in itself, so the only difference came from leaving the danger far away or near at hand. Subaru, okay. We shall go together. It doesn't look like we can count on you, but I have high hopes of you coming up with ideas. Shala, he's talking to you, lil ankle biter. Do your best. Beatrice, he's talking to you, I suppose? What were you listening to, in fact? Shala curled her lips with a look on her face of having brought up a topic that she shouldn't have. Whilst listening to Beatrice's angry yells, the group opened the door of a room opposite to the green room, and when they peered inside, they found the stairs that led up there. Subaru, we're done with spiral staircases. Shala, the 4th floor Alcyone and the 3rd floor Teijida are directly connected. I don't really go up unless I got business, so I've seldom been. Subaru, what this business you refer to? Shala, it's a young maiden's secret. Moving his gaze away from Shala as soon as she started to show signs of her inanities, Subaru looked over at Julius. Him and the others should have already challenged the 3rd floor whilst he'd slept. He expected that he'd be able to hear something useful out of him, but that night calmly shrugged his shoulders. Julius, I apologize for this when you have expectations, but we understood very little about it. Immediately after you climb up to the 3rd floor, you'll come across the room that's referred to as a trial, but... Subaru, but? Julius, what lies there is an unintelligible enigma. The honest truth is that we weren't able to find any clues to solve it, and we ended up having no idea what to do. Subaru, an unintelligible enigma. Subaru shifted his attention to the top of the stairs without getting the point in Julius' words. The floor above was dark, and he wasn't able to tell how it looked from below. However, that stillness made it look more sinister. Amelia, but it doesn't look like you can just enter and see what to do. Nothing really changed even when we went in and out. We were simply just given the cold shoulder. Beatrice, it makes me so irritated when I think on how we were ignored, I suppose. It seemed like Amelia and Beatrice also agreed with Julius' impression. In reality, although it was said to be a trial, none of them had been able to challenge it. His levels of wariness had just shot up as the word ordeal closely resembled it. Subaru, well, it can't be helped. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Then let us go? Amelia, yeah, that's the spirit. Beatrice, that's the spirit, in fact. Shala, that's the spirit. Receiving all three of their affirmations each in their own manner of speaking, Subaru took the initiative and put one of his feet on the stairs. Then, step by step, he headed up towards the floor above. Unlike the spiral staircases from before, the number of steps to get to the 3rd floor was about the same as an ordinary building. Thus, in contrast to his preparedness, Subaru stormed straight into the 3rd floor Teijida to the point that it felt he'd gotten there way too quickly. Subaru, I'm in a... Immediately after he entered, Subaru felt an overwhelming sense of unease. A clump of unease, or rather should he say that it was an expanse that invited nothing but unease. It was a white expanse. Although it must be an extension of the tower that had up until now been cylindrical in shape, what greeted Subaru after he'd climbed the stairs was a strange expanse completely dyed in white in every direction. The expanse-like vastness shouldn't have been that different in size to the tower so far, but neither its walls, nor the end could be seen in this incredibly white expanse. When he looked up above, he couldn't tell where the ceiling was. When he looked down at his feet, only the part where the stairs were was a slightly ajar black. Other than that, the floor was so white that it made him scared to walk on it. He couldn't tell that the floor was the floor, or he'd end up being hit by an illusion that felt like he was in continuous free fall just about everywhere. The ceiling and the walls were the same. Subaru felt like he'd probably end up going crazy if he lost sight of the stairs that led downstairs here. And, at the front of this white expanse right in front of the stairs, there was a strange object floating up. Subaru, a stone slab. That was the impression that slipped out from Subaru's mouth when he looked at that object. In fact, the object was such that it could only be expressed like so. It was a single, black slab, that had been built in the shape of a quadrilateral, and had an incredibly smooth feeling to it. He couldn't call it a stone slab if it wasn't built from stone, but he had no other way of calling it considering that it wasn't metallic as well. If he really had to call it something else that was more flashy, then he'd probably use the term monolith. The silent monolith had acquired a strange floating power and was floating up dozens of centimeters above the floor. Or at least it should be. His eyes were thrown completely out of whack in checking how far it was off the ground due to the whiteness of the floor, and it became more and more unclear to him. However, the monolith that was floating in midair was there cool as you like. It was roughly the same height as Subaru, and its width was about the size of two people lined up together. If he had to put it as something that was similar in size to it, then the impression he got was like as if a tatami was floating up. Subaru, what the heck is this strange thing? Julius, if I were to try and put it into different words, I'd say this is the contrivance that stuck out this enigma before us. Julius glared at the monolith, standing beside Subaru, whose awareness had been gripped by this strange spectacle. Julius' face looked sterner than usual, as if he'd been already made to experience great hardship by the monolith many times over. The rest of them had made it up to the third floor now, and were huddled together in an effort to ward off the indistinct atmosphere present inside of the white expanse. Subaru, this ain't a room I want to stay long in. Julius, that I agree. If we stay here too long, it's quite likely that we'll lose our sense of balance. And if you end up running towards the stairs and your feet slip, I imagine your life could end up being cut short, wouldn't you think? Anastasia, yoo-hoo, Julius. Stop with the unnecessary prattle. Anastasia puffed out her cheeks in protest at Julius' prattle. It looked like she'd slipped on the way back before, which is what Julius was referring to. However, Subaru had no intention of laughing at that mishap. In actual fact, this room had been clearly made with the goal of putting people's senses out of whack. The room seemed like it embodied the wickedness of the nature of the person who'd made it. Subaru, so, what should we do about the main mystery? Beatrice, you should touch that slab, in fact. The trial begins if you do, I suppose. Subaru, should I really touch the monolith? Julius, Monolith? That's a name that fits quite well with its mysteriousness. Let's call it like that from now on. Subaru stepped away from Julius, who was in admiration of that strangeness, and moved forward on their behalf. Since no one stopped him, he walked all the way over to the monolith. He'd expected the monolith to let off a strange, ominous feeling when he approached, but it wasn't like that. It was pretty much just a plain old slab of stone other than the fact it was floating. When he thought of it like a tatami floating about, he felt the fear he'd had at first fade just a little. Subaru, anyways, so I'll go ahead and touch it? Can I get a countdown? Emilia, right, I'd like to do it. 3, 2, 1. Subaru, so damn quick. I got this though. Emilia raised her hand up and volunteered to Subaru's appeal, then her countdown began. As she counted down, Subaru panicked and turned around to face the monolith. And then. Emilia, 0. Subaru touched the monolith at the same time she counted 0, and the next moment, the surface of the black slab glowed from the inside. Just as it did, the scene in front of his eyes grew blurred. No, it wasn't exactly blurred. The monolith which Subaru had touched started to grow in numbers whilst glowing with a black radiance. The monolith shot out replicated monolith after monolith from its back whilst making their surface glow. They were all hurled across the room at an incredible rate of knots, scattered in strange positions, all floating. Countless monoliths had been strewn out across the white expanse, and Subaru had been taken by surprise by that change. Then, passing through the awestruck Subaru's eardrum straight to his brain, a voice echoed. Touch the brightest of the hero destroyed by Shala. Subaru, hook. Subaru jerked his hand away from the monolith in surprise when he heard that voice ring out so abruptly. And, as he staggered back, someone propped his back up from behind. He turned around to look at them. There, he found Julius' face. Julius touched his fringe with his left hand as he propped Subaru up with his right and said, Julius, well, look at this. Our first surprise, can I count on you sympathizing with it, I wonder? Subaru, what an asshole-ish thing to say. Subaru's protests only made Julius' sardonic smile grow deeper. In any case, the trial had genuinely started now. The trial of the Great Library Pleiades, 3rd floor Teijida. Time limit, no restrictions. Number of attempts, no restrictions. Challengers, no restrictions. Trial, start. Chapter 22, The Asterism of the White Starry Sky. After he untangled himself from Julius and stood unaided, he turned to face the trial. In front of Subaru's eyes, the figures of countless replica monoliths were spread out across the white expanse from the heart of the monolith he'd touched. To be honest, there were so many of them that he'd get sick and tired were he to count them. Subaru, this would be the trial you meant. Right, Shala? Shala, looks like it, right? I want to see Master flaunt his forte. Subaru, don't start saying stuff like a band would at a drinking party. He wouldn't know since he'd never been to one, but that was probably how things went there. Subaru looked around the room behind Shala, who'd cheered him on with her easygoing manner. The floor was still enveloped in white, with everything from their ability to tell distance to their ability to tell height going haywire. The only change that stood out were the monoliths that were dotted about the place, but those two weren't particularly different from the first one. There seemed to be a bit of a difference in size between them, but other than that, they were the same in that they both floated in midair and were made of a strange material. Subaru, speaking of stuff that we were given as a clue other than those, there's still that thing from before. What he'd recalled was the voice that had echoed inside his brain when he touched the monolith. Touch the brightest of the hero destroyed by Shala. The sound hadn't come through his eardrums, but rather it had been whispered straight to his brain inside his skull. It had been closer to that. The voice he'd heard hadn't been a sound, so the general concept of it being someone's voice couldn't be applied here. If he were to put it in other words, it was like the words had been jammed into his brain like a sentence that he'd thought of. There was no sound in his thoughts. Thus, you couldn't comprehend who the voice belonged to. If anything, it was from himself. Subaru, that voice which could be heard was the trial question, you reckon? If that's the case. Julius, Subaru, I'm sorry to interrupt whilst you're thinking, but there's a few important things I have to say. I don't think it'll hurt to go ahead after hearing those. Julius, who'd played a practical joke on him earlier, said that to Subaru whilst he racked his mind. Nearby the stairs which led down, Amelia and the rest of them were circled around the monolith frozen around it. Every one of them looked puzzled. Subaru shrugged his shoulders in appreciation of Julius, who was beckoning them to his side, and said, "Oh. Subaru, is that so? All of you challenged it before whilst I was sleeping. Did you make any progress?" Julius, I guess I can't really call it progress. Anyways. Subaru, please try and touch the stone slab. I mean, the monolith that's right here. Subaru, does doing this please you that much? Well, sure, whatever. Subaru narrowed his eyes at Julius, who'd stuck to referring to it as a monolith, and walked over to the monolith that was on his right-hand side. The slab was one of the replicas of the original monolith. As he got closer, he could see that this one was just a little smaller than the original. Subaru, what if it's a trap, where the moment I touch it my arm gets swallowed up? Beatrice, it's okay in fact. If something like that happened, Betty would become your right arm for the rest of your life, I suppose. Amelia, then I'd become Subaru's left hand. You can rest assured. Subaru, both of my arms would be gone if we suppose that though. Thanks to Beatrice and Amelia's reassuring pledges, Subaru summoned up his courage and stretched out his hand to the monolith. He wasn't really worried about the act of touching it in itself. So long as his companions had recommended him to do this, and didn't try to stop him, he had no reason to doubt his safety. The issue was simply the chance that they were concealing the truth as with the monoliths replicating themselves. Subaru? Still full of anxiety, as soon as his fingertips brushed against the monolith, the black stone slab shone so brightly that it almost scorched his eyes. In fact, its radiance had caused Subaru to hold his breath and immediately cover his face with his arm. Then, after the light faded away, what remained in front of Subaru's eyes was. Subaru, huh? Where did the monolith go? Shala, behind you, master. Subaru, behind me. After that flash of light, Subaru affirmed that the monolith that should have been in front of him had disappeared. Surprised by what had happened, he turned to look behind him at Shala, who had nonsensically shouted out in triumph. When he turned around, at the front of the stairs, in other words, at the place where the original monolith had stood, the first monolith stood alone. All the rest of them had disappeared from the room. Subaru, so, in other words. This means? Julius, that everything went back to its original state. To put it shortly, it looks like we've been deemed to have messed up by the trial. Of course. Stepping away from the dejected Subaru's side, Julius carelessly approached the original monolith. And then, immediately after he stretched out his hand and touched its surface, that voice echoed out through his mind. Touch the brightest of the hero destroyed by Shala. Once again, at the same time which the challenge was posed to them, monolith after monolith were replicated from the original and scattered all around the room with the same force as before. The trial was distributed around therefrom. In other words, they could call this a retry. Subaru, I see. It must mean we can think as much as we want until we find an answer. Julius, that's our guess right now. There happens to be this monolith, but I can say that even when we went around touching monoliths at random, we couldn't find an answer. Subaru, so you've already tried brute forcing it? Subaru broke down Julius' mild manner of speaking to the bread and bones of it. Emilia and Meili, who'd heard that explanation, were patting their heads with what seemed to be a look of embarrassment about them. Just try touching and checking every single one of them. Certainly, it looked like they'd tried to carry out that tactic. Nevertheless, it didn't seem to have done the trick. Subaru, it's a trial after all. It means we have to solve the problem and answer it. Julius, it looks like our examiner doesn't appreciate answers that are just given out at random. Subaru, yeah, seems so. So like a sensei who doesn't give you credit unless you write down all of your working out, and doesn't allow you to just put answers in the test's answer column. The anti-cheating measures sure do appear quickly though. Reaching an answer without showing how you derived it could only come as a result of cheating or a hunch. Oftentimes, till primary school, he'd come across problems which he'd find answers to using his hunches, but the main point to mathematics was to learn how to derive the problem, not to regurgitate the problem willy-nilly on the spot. One time during primary school, when he'd been marked down for the lack of clarity in his working out, he remembered how resentful he'd been about it, but Subaru, after all this time, it looks like my sensei was right. Anastasia, I'm sorry Ta, but when you're still absorbed in your thoughts, not Tsukiko-an, but rather your turn ain't from here. Come on, snap back to reality, snap back. Subaru, oh, my bad. But what do you mean by my turn? Anastasia called Subaru, whose eyes had glazed over, back to reality, and then clapped her hand on his back. As Subaru tilted his head at her appeal, everyone looked around at each other, and broke into mutters. What they were saying was the same thing, so combining it and paraphrasing it into other words, it's down to Subaru to find out who the hero destroyed by Shala is. Emilia, we challenged the trial many times over until Subaru woke up. However, that girl wouldn't even tell us whether or not she was Shala when we did. Beatrice, as far as we were concerned, Shala was the sage in fact. We thought they were the person on the drawing engraved on the silver coin, so we didn't connect this woman with Shala, I suppose. Those were Emilia and Beatrice's replies, both of whom hadn't been able to hear Shala's story till then. Ever since Subaru had woken up, he'd seen Shala communicate with him with an air of overfamiliarity that was way off the marks of typical friendliness, and because of that it was hard to believe for him that she'd refused to say anything to them. However, her not telling them anything more couldn't be helped since she'd kept her mouth shut towards those in the tower. Having said that though, Subaru was still worried. Even if Shala had had her tongue unsealed, and became able to talk about that. Subaru, I guess it doesn't hurt to ask. Hey, Shala. If you know anything, please tell me everything about the hero you destroyed. Shala, leave this to me. Remembering stuff like each of the names of the guys I've killed is second-class work. For a first-class individual like me, I don't remember past the 100 mark. Subaru, of course you'd say that. Shala gave him a thumbs and then winked. Receiving that vigorous response, Subaru slapped his knee. Just as he'd expected and feared, her reply was an airheaded Shala-like one. He had suspected that was likely going to happen with how she'd acted and talked till now. There was the chance that she, who would seemingly know the answer to the hero that Shala destroyed, didn't remember it anywhere in her head. Julius, however, we won't make any progress if we end it with that. Miss Shala, do you really not remember anything? It doesn't matter even if it's a tiny little detail. Shala, that's easier said than done. I just hell snipe everyone who comes near to the tower, and their corpses end up being cleaned up by the witch beasts outside. Anastasia, okay, but ISN that's strange? Could it be a trial to see whether we can reveal the tower's knowledge in the first place? It'd be a strange sequence of events for it to require us to show something that happened after Shala-san's tenure in protecting the tower started. Shala had pouted, saying she didn't have any clue, but Anastasia pointed out the out-of-place feeling in what she'd said. Everyone other than Shala had agreed with her opinion with an IC. For sure, it was difficult to imagine that the problem posed inside the tower came about after her tenure in the tower had started. Then naturally that meant the period of time which Shala had destroyed the hero came before the tower's construction. Beatrice, in other words, that means it's from before you started firing at people at random, in fact. Come on, remember, I suppose. It's like all of your nourishment ended up just in your buttocks and breasts, so your memories become poor, in fact. Shala, this appearance was chosen by my mother. But, it wouldn't be honest of me if I said I remember. Before the tower was built, right? Emilia, yeah, that's right. Before the tower was built. During that time, do you happen to know of anyone that you destroyed? Gathered near the stairway with Shala in the middle of them, they desperately tried to awaken her memories. However, Shala, who was basked in everyone's expectations, gave no signs that they'd been successful, and she groaned out with an Aegean. Subaru, is it true or not that you've been around since 400 years ago? If I name a bunch of the noteworthy people around that time, you wouldn't happen to have killed 2 or 3 of them, would you? Shala, master, are you thinking that about me? I'm a maiden who likes to dabble with flowers, you know. Subaru, that's no maiden, more like a caterpillar. Emilia, Subaru, I think your way of speaking just now was ever so rude. If she doesn't want to remember, then don't push her and force her to. Subaru, Emilia Tan, your kindness is your super virtue, your best feature, but this woman is the more you pamper her, the more useless she becomes type, don't you think? I can tell. 'Cause I'm the same. Emilia had firmly puffed out her chest and declared that. But it wasn't that Shala couldn't remember because she didn't want to in the first place, but rather that her memory was so poor that she just couldn't. The topic was one which he'd wanted to handle delicately since one of his members had a bunch of difficult problems in regards to memories, but it was a different matter when it came to Shala. Subaru, practically, it'll be no problem if I fire off some random names, right? I don't know how one of them striking the answer would react with the monoliths though. Anastasia, it's definitely gotta be as Natsuki-kun says. I wonder though, even if we find out the answer, how can we then touch the brightest? Considering that the monolith he touched had disappeared, and the trial seemed to have adjudicated them as having messed up, he could predict that their answer's final form would probably be to touch the correct monolith. The issue then was how they would find the correct monolith. Even if they chipped at Shala's memories, he didn't get the feeling like it had become clear, one could say. Meili, but even if we think forever, we won't make any progress, right? Since Naked One Isan is pretty cooperative, I think we might as well ask her. Still holding on to Shala's bare shoulders, Meili butted in between the adults who were stumbling over what to do. She looked at the group of monoliths with a look of boredom on her face as she fiddled about with Shala's scorpion tail. Meili, there's no ickle witch beasties around, there's no progress, and it's really not fun here. Speed things up, I want to go back to the mansion. Everyone was at a loss for words at the words which Meili had uttered. Following straight after that, Meili said, "What is it?" as Subaru patted her head. Meili, what is it I wonder? Subaru, nothing, I just think it's as you say. You're right. This place is sandy as hell, and on top of that, there's a bunch of scary witch beasts prowling about outside. We'll quickly take care of things here, settle all our problems. Wake up REM, retrieve a means to save the people in need, and then we shall skedaddle out of here. Treading around things with anxiety before attempting them was a waste of valuable time. It felt to him like the trial had been set up by someone rather ill-natured, and that he was playing right into their hands. Shala, master. You do know that there's an easy-to-stroke head right next to that lil ankle biter. Subaru, I said this already. You're the same as me in that you're the type which when pampered falls unendingly into corruption. That's why from here on out we're doing this the Spartan way. Hurry the hell up and remember. Shala, do I have to? Puffing her cheeks out in dissatisfaction, Shala seemed to be in full pout. However, she'd be easy to handle since after a few dozen seconds she'd start humming with a face like she'd forgotten. Julius, well then, our young lady requests it too. Shall we try and get on with testing out the possibilities we have in front of us without dithering about? Anastasia, that's probably a good idea. It's relieving that it's okay even if we fail a bunch of times. In most cases in human life, things are decided in just a single bout. So, this is quite a generous problem, don't you think? Although Meili had set things off in motion, Julius and Anastasia had also come into agreement with her. Thus, it was time to make her remember the hero destroyed and forgotten by Shala once again. Subaru, for now let's go with a name that you remembered, yeah. How about Reed? That dude was the first ever sword saint, you killed him, didn't you? Shala, Meili, Jaya. Subaru, third base cleanup. Straight after he'd nonchalantly pulled out that name, Shala let out a high-pitched shriek and leapt backwards. Subaru performed a diving catch on Meili, who'd been dropped having been unable to withstand that injection of momentum. After he safely brought Meili back to the ground, Shala, who jumped up and fled far away into the room, had gotten smaller in view. Subaru, hey. I'm sorry. I don't really know why you're acting like that, but get back here. Shala, please don't say such scary stuff. Master's a real mean guy. The absolute worst. A maiden's distress. A liability issue. Even though she spoke frivolously, Shala's voice as she skulked back was shaking feebly. She sure did act tough, but she wasn't all that. Unmistakably, fear and dread had caused her to react like that. Naturally, the reason behind her fear could only be but one. Subaru, is the first sword saint such a scary person? Julius, how foolish. Reinhardt, Wilhelm Sama, and such are esteemed individuals worthy of the forefather of the Astria family. He definitely wasn't just skilled with the sword, but a man of character as well. Certainly, there are some parts sprinkled into the anecdotes that were left behind as rumors that indicate that he was rather strong-willed, which don't overlap with Reinhardt and the rest, but if it's not like that, then wouldn't that mean the history of the Astria family has been twisted till this current generation? Subaru, not really, but when you unravel history, and the viewpoint of prominent statesmen also changes, you'll find that Japanese history is sufficiently cruel too. If we compare it to that, then I mean we can't really start speaking about definites here. Julius, dear goodness, let's not delve into this sort of talk. It's alright. We can get a clarification to the story if we get her to talk, as she's a living witness here. Come now, let's listen to her. Julius started to ramble on with tremendous vigor at Subaru, who had hazarded a guess at Reed's temperament from Shala's reaction. And to make matters worse, he'd handled things by dismissing Subaru, who tried to defend his point, with a laugh. After so long, Subaru could once again see a glimpse of the figure of that gaudy knight which he'd first seen at the royal selection. He now knew that his attitude back then had been down to him playing the villain. Though, whenever he saw him like this, he sure did get the impression that he still was like when they'd first met. In any case, Julius, your impressions regarding the first sword saint, Reed Astria. Miss Shala, I'd like you to tell us your candid impression of him. Shala, he was human garbage. Julius, I'd like you to tell us your candid impression of him. Subaru, don't pretend like she didn't say anything. Subaru shoved Julius' shoulder, who'd tried to ignore that inconvenient tidbit, and made him face the facts. Pointing his finger at Shala, who had a troubled look on her face, Subaru continued. Subaru, hey, listen up. The truth about the history you wanted to know about is right here. She's a living witness to it. Go on, tell me as many anecdotes about Reed Astria as you like, of that magnanimous man of character skilled in the sword. Julius, those who hold exceptional talent end up having confidence in themselves, more or less. That shouldn't be chastised, rather, it should be something you take pride in. If you end up becoming the greatest swordsman recorded in history, even acting like such as, yeah, when you take into account how things were back then, it would be suitable. Subaru, it's the first time I've seen you so desperate. Julius too became flustered, as if he was considering just how unconvincing he sounded. Setting Julius aside, who'd been betrayed by the history which he ever so loved, Shala's truth of Reed Astria was pouring out of her without an end in sight. Shala, well, anyways, he was a nasty guy. His personality was like that of an unruly brat's in adult form, and he loved to bully the weak. Or I guess if we look at it from that garbage's point of view, almost all of his opponents were weak, so he'd be bullying the weak no matter who he fought against. He did that a lot to me too. Amelia, but he was able to keep doing that to you even though you're so strong? Ah, since it happened over 400 years ago, you must have still been small then too? Shala, I've been like this ever since I was born. So, between now and back then, I've not changed, however. That thing was just out of the ordinary. A total piece of shit. Garbage, piece of shit, the hero of your had been harshly evaluated as such. The darkness wasn't vanishing from Shala's attitude, as if many hateful memories had come flooding back to her. It was the same as when a person who'd been bullied recalled what the bully had done to them. Shala, you should always keep that piece of shit in mind. Even if the bully forgets, the one bullied absolutely never will, and that's a fact. Subaru, I'm not really surprised since there's a precedent in Reinhardt, but it'd take quite a monster to knock you down a few pegs, and Reed Astria's one too. Shala, he really was the worst. But I was able to get him to use both hands once every 10 times we fought. Subaru, I see. He could only answer with that. Had she set her goals high or low in making him use both of his hands once every 10 times, and not to gain victory once every 10 times? Subaru felt like he wouldn't be able to make Reinhardt use both his hands even once every 100 times, so he could admit that her putting up a fight like that had been plenty enough. Subaru, well, we can put off asking about Reed. It's pretty pointless for us to ask if you didn't destroy him. Julius, I agree. There's other things we ought to prioritize right now. Subaru, didn't you waste time doing that just now? Subaru couldn't tell whether he had a scholarly interest in it, or it was a curiosity spurred from a simple hobby, but he judged that for now, perhaps Julius wouldn't be of any use. Although he felt sorry for Julius, who'd had his illusions shattered, unfortunately for him, Subaru had no reason to care about Reinhardt's ancestor right now. To begin with, Reinhardt himself was already more than plenty enough amazing, no matter how amazing his bloodline was. At least considering his father's nature, he was sure that Reinhardt had been abounding in it. Subaru, then, let's leave all speculation about who the hero is to the guy who knows best. Julius, gotcha. I shall humbly accept. Subaru, I still wasn't talking about you, but sure. Go for it. Biko, help him out with it. Beatrice, gotcha, in fact. He left the task to Julius since he was willing to do it. And getting Beatrice to assist him as a helper, who boasted 400 years of knowledge, was ideal. Emilia, then what shall we do? Subaru, we'll take a closer look at the surroundings. He'd leave the hero-related stuff to Julius and Beatrice, who'd remain by Shala, and meanwhile he wanted to take a look at the arrangement issue. Namely, how the replicated monoliths were arranged. If there was some significance to their uneven arrangement, then taking the time to search for the pattern behind it probably wouldn't be a waste. Subaru, first of all, the first one is in front of the stairs. Emilia, it's the monolith that hands out the question, right? The monoliths weren't lined up in a narrow enough space to the extent that they had to be careful not to bump into them. Nevertheless, Subaru took Anastasia and Emilia and looked around the monoliths inside the room. There was a surprising difference in size between the scattered monoliths when he double-checked. However, there wasn't a single one of them that was as large as the series of original monoliths. The figures of countless monoliths which were 1 or 2 times smaller were scattered about after them. Subaru, when you take a look at it, I guess there's about 7 or 8 monoliths that are about the same size as the first monolith. Emilia, I guess so? Yeah, I think so too. I think the ones that are really far away are all quite small. We'll end up restarting things if we touch those too, though. Subaru, from the way you're talking about it, it looks like you've done that before. Ah, sorry. Never mind about that. Seeing sadness build up in Emilia's eyes, Subaru caught himself before he said too much. Returning back in front of the first monolith, Subaru turned to face the 2 girls and plunged into thought. Subaru, touch the brightest of the hero destroyed by Shala. I feel like it's trying to say something cool. Anastasia, I guess it must be saying something abstract. Unfortunately, we can't go overlooking the question when we take into account what comes out of relying on Shala-san's memory. Subaru, well, I suppose so. In essence, relying on others, or on the being that had been left behind in the tower as its warden, to get that answer was really unfair, with it being labeled as a trial. Subaru and the others hadn't expected friendly contact when they'd made it to the tower. However, they ended up making it into the tower without coming to blows with Shala. If it hadn't ended up like that, they would have fallen into a quagmire of massacre. Even if they'd successfully made it into the tower in that case, they likely wouldn't have been able to defeat Shala. Emilia, if we do that, passing the trial is going to be forever impossible, right? Subaru, that's correct if you're saying they have no intention of letting us solve the trial. They could put a strong guardian as a defense mechanism, and worse, were we to kill said guardian, they could put a terrible barrier that wouldn't let us pass. Emilia, but you don't think that. You think it's different to that? Subaru, MHMHMM. Emilia turned her eyes in anticipation towards Subaru, who touched on this issue of security. Receiving her gaze, Subaru confirmed her thoughts with a chuckle. Those eyes were Subaru's weakness. Subaru grew weak whenever Emilia and Beatrice gave him those looks. REM, Garfield and Otto would occasionally look at him like that too. Coupled with Petra, that made far too many. The only ones who didn't look at him like that were Patrash and Ram. Subaru, it somehow feels like I could see a trend. Emilia, Subaru, it's nothing, just talking to myself. Subaru's bluff wouldn't have worked against those who could see through him. Of course, he was bailed out thanks to Emilia not being one of those who'd question him about it. Anyways, putting that aside and going back to the problem of the format of the trial. Subaru, exceptions aside, fundamentally the problem was constructed with the assumption that it can be solved. If you really wanted to hide things properly, it'd be smarter not to leave them somewhere where there's a chance of finding them. Anastasia, but Natsuki-kun, your VE eyeballed this place as not being like that? Subaru, what was it that the keeper of this place, Shala, said? She said this is a great library where you can get all the knowledge you desire. I don't think Shala herself could come up with such a fancy-looking phrase, so I think she's splurging out words that were told to her by someone else. Meaning that Flugel, who built this library and entrusted it to Shala, intended for it to be used. The more he unraveled the possibilities, the more unnatural the current situation became to him. The creator of this great library, Pleiades, must have taken steps to set it up so that the purpose of the building worked. He'd left behind the trial and Shala here as a means to screen people for that. Subaru, does this mean that no one but those who get along well with Shala can use it to begin with? Emilia, but Shala said that she attacked everyone who approached the tower, right? Yeah, that was right. The command that had been given to Shala was to eliminate anyone who approached the tower without any exceptions, and Subaru and the others coming into friendly contact with Shala had just been a stroke of luck. If he recklessly concluded that people wouldn't get the qualifications to challenge the tower unless they abounded in fortuity, then. Anastasia, so what you need is strength, luck, and charm so that you're able to make friends with Shala-san? I think our lineup is pretty unfit for that challenge. Subaru. It sure is. If they'd been defeated by Shala, killed by her, or been unable to get her to cooperate with them, then they'd have lost the qualifications to challenge the Great Library Pleiades. Although it was irrational to think so, if he listed all the conditions up till now, he could only come to that conclusion. However, Subaru couldn't help but have a bad feeling in just accepting that. And Emilia, hey. Subaru, Emilia? Emilia, I'm feeling quite a bit uneasy. I've got a real bad feeling in and around my chest. Emilia placed her hand to the pit of her stomach and anxiously spilled that out. As he was about to draw his eyes to that, Subaru restrained himself before he ogled her pale skin. Clearing his throat with an ahem, he frowned at Emilia and said, "A bad feeling? Subaru, is something on your mind?" Emilia, to tell you the truth, there is. But this may have nothing to do with everything, and even if I say it out loud, I think only you would understand me. Subaru, I think I'd like you to say whatever's on your mind right now, so you can say it to me. My thoughts aren't necessarily correct, and it's honestly a good thing to think about things from multiple different angles. Emilia, really? Having been immersed in her thoughts about what she was holding back, Emilia's face brightened a little as she heard his words. Then she continued speaking, saying, in that case. Emilia, when you touched the monolith, you guys could hear a voice inside of your head, right? Anastasia, yeah. It's an uncanny contraption, but I wonder what the heck it is. Emilia, it's that voice, but isn't it similar to the one back at the ordeal of the sanctuary? Subaru and Anastasia. Subaru and Anastasia both kept their silence when they heard Emilia's suggestion. However, even if both of them had ended up staying silent, the reason why they'd done so had been different. Anastasia had plunged into silence because she had no clue what those words meant, but Subaru's silence had been because he'd been taken by surprise and understood her words. The ordeals those had taken place at the witch Echidna's graveyard, who'd lived in the sanctuary. Those mystifying phenomena that made you confront the past/differing presents, Subaru didn't know the full details of them as he'd retired halfway through, but according to Echidna back at the graveyard, there'd been a third ordeal too, which Emilia had overcome. No, in this case the details and hardships of that ordeal weren't what was important here. What was important was that refrain that had informed them about the details of the ordeal using their own voice was pretty much the same as when they challenged that ordeal. Subaru, now that you mention it, you're right. Why did that slip out of my mind? I guess 'cause they're bad memories? Emilia, Subaru, that's because you really dislike Echidna, no? Anastasia, hook. Subaru, going through an experience where a savior turns out to actually be an eminence grise is gonna end up making you look like me. Since the sanctuary, Emilia and Subaru had spoken about the witches only once or twice. Even after they touched on the subject of the ordeal, Emilia liked to skirt around it, so he hadn't pursued the topic too much. The point that they both shared in common was that they thought Echidna was an ill-natured fiend. Emilia sugar-coated it more when speaking, but Subaru spoke about her as it was. Anastasia, why, you freaked me out 'cause you mentioned Echidna's name. Emilia, I see. Anastasia's artificial is called Echidna too. She does speak in a really similar manner, right? 'Tis strange. Subaru, yeah, it's strange, but let's settle this another time, alright? So, it's similar to the ordeal. When he'd heard the word trial mentioned, he'd thought that it sounded similar to ordeal. When it came to the parts that resembled the ordeal till the start, this was probably one part of a system, or perhaps it was a great part of it that resembled the one at the graveyard. Subaru, come to think of it, the ordeal too was practically unlimited in how much you could challenge it. Emilia, and what's more, about the trials, there's the third floor, the second floor and the first, totaling 3 here too, right? Subaru. Subaru and Emilia looked at each other as if they were saying, yeah, it's definitely like that. The sage's name, and the 400 years time period. When he looked back on it, it felt inevitable that history overlapped with the period of time of those witches. Emilia, yeah, though I'm sorry. Even if we know that much, it still doesn't bring us any closer to the answer, huh? Having thought all the way up to there, Emilia cut her story short with a flustered look on her face. Just as Emilia had concluded, even if there was a chance that this place had some relation to the graveyard, it still had nothing to do with the trial of Teegida. The name of the hero who was destroyed by Shala was still something that they had to rely on Shala for. Subaru, actually, isn't it not like that? Emilia, Subaru? Subaru, if we presume this place is something that's supposed to be solvable, then isn't saying that it can't be captured unless Shala manages to a mistake in the first place. This was the Tower of the Sage, and that had been the graveyard of the witch. Both of these examiners shared in the same wicked disposition, but if that wasn't only what they had in common, they had a conceivable chance to overcome them. The witch had tested people out in her ordeals, but she didn't give them any hardships that couldn't produce results. Then if the sage tested people in his trials, then he shouldn't give them any hardships that couldn't produce results. Subaru, a chance for us to be able to capture the tower without needing Shala. Anastasia, Natsuki-kun, what did you think of? Emilia, SHHH. Plunging into his thoughts, Subaru placed his hand on his chin, closed one of his eyes, and sunk into speculation. As he did so, Emilia waved her hand and silenced Anastasia, who'd seen a ray of hope glimmering in what was occurring and spoken up. Emilia put her finger to her lips and made a shushing gesture at her, telling her to stay quiet, and after that, she turned her head back to look at Subaru. Her amethyst eyes sparkled with anticipation. Not taking any notice of Emilia's anticipation, Subaru's head spun in thought. In this trial, Shala's presence wasn't important. Perhaps there was even a chance that those challenging the tower could destroy Shala were she to attack them. If he presumed that they still didn't even know Shala's name. Subaru, even if we didn't know that Shala is Shala, if we assume a Shala was involved. Emilia and Anastasia. Subaru, we mistakenly believed that Flugel's achievement had been Shala's. The sage's achievement was that he sealed the witch with the help of the first sword saint and the divine dragon. However, the witch of envy ain't something that we'd ever call something like a hero, nor was she ever destroyed. He cut out that possibility as being an incorrect hypothesis right here. Maybe there'd been another heroic tale which the sage Flugel had forced on Shala that he just didn't know about. However, it didn't make any sense that Beatrice and Julius hadn't recalled something like that. An inevitable possibility floated up in his mind. Subaru, even if we didn't know that Shala is Shala, if we assume a Shala was involved, that's it. He once again repeated what he'd said. That didn't mean his thoughts were going around in circles. It was the opposite. He'd cut out one of the possibilities and another one had surfaced. And what that meant was, Subaru, Biko. Come here for a sec. Following the possibility that had struck him, Subaru lifted his face up and called Beatrice over. Julius was trying everything he could to try and pry open the lid on Shala's memories. Next to him, Beatrice sprung up when she heard Subaru's voice that indicated he'd managed to find something. She rushed over to him and said, Beatrice, that face is Betty's favorite Subaru face, I suppose. Subaru, shouldn't all of them be your favorite? Beatrice, this one especially, in fact. Beatrice said that without any traces of embarrassment to her, and Subaru stretched out his hand over to her as she stood in front of him. Beatrice took his hand and looked at him with her round blue eyes. Her eyes were asking, what do you want me to do? Thus, Subaru nodded and said, Subaru, it's quite simple. I'd like to jump a bit higher with Murak. Beatrice, don't tell me you're going to say I've given up, so let's break the ceiling and go up that way, I suppose. Subaru, don't be so shocked. Of course not. I just want to look down on the monoliths from above. Emilia, look down on the monoliths. Behind him, Emilia turned around to look at the monoliths and muttered that out. Even if she didn't know what he expected to get from it, Beatrice didn't show any intent of wanting to ask any more about it. She let out a small sigh and gripped his hand more tightly. Beatrice, Murak, in fact. Pale, light purple waves faintly wrapped themselves around Subaru's body following her incantation. Murak was magic which kept the effects of gravity at bay and made you far more agile. Just by jumping lightly he'd be able to float up by about 1 meter, and if he kicked off from the floor with all his strength then. Subaru, up we go. Still holding Beatrice's hand, Subaru leapt up towards the top of the tall room. Although he'd made it up by 6 or 7 meters, his body didn't crash into the ceiling as he'd expected. The layer had expanded as if there'd been no ceiling at all inside of this endless white expanse. Thus, Subaru was able to look down on the entire room from above. Subaru, it's as I thought. Beatrice, were you able to find what you were looking for, I suppose? Subaru, of course. This place is the absolute worst. Subaru frowned and nodded, seeing Beatrice's gaze, who'd heard his mutter wrapped inside of his arms. The two of them turned towards the ground and dropped down. Their lightness of body, that had helped them leap up, also helped grace their landing. They landed without any issue, and he lowered Beatrice, who he'd been princess carrying, down to the floor. Subaru, I know the name of the hero. Emilia, really? Subaru said that with conviction to Emilia, who'd seen him muse about it and then leap up. Emilia reacted in surprise to his words, and Anastasia rounded her eyes as well. Hearing them speak, Julius and the others with him who'd been captivated by their talk gathered over to where Subaru and the others were. Meili, Oni-san figured it out? Subaru, I solved it. Along with the line of thinking of this errant examiner for now. Shala, that's master for you. You're making me feel all tingly. Oh, how I yearned for this. With Meili on her back, Shala gave him a thumbs up and replied, then she shook her head vigorously. Looking at that from the corner of his eye, Julius looked over to the group of monoliths and said, Julius, I don't mean to doubt you right now. But please tell me how you managed to get the answer. Subaru, it's nothing spectacular. You needn't feel bad for not solving this. Because in the first place, the people who have a chance at solving this are few. This problem was the most contemptible in that sense. The challengers had to overcome the obstacle that was Shala, understand the details of the problem, and yet from the start, they'd been narrowed down by the likelihood of knowing the answer to the problem. Subaru, the hero destroyed by Shala, his name is Orion. Everyone, Orion. Everyone looked at Shala in confusion after they heard the word that Subaru had spoken out. However, Shala vigorously shook her head as everyone's gazes converged on her, and said, I don't know them. Shala, no pino, I've no idea who that is. And even if for a sec we assume I did kill them, what sort of person who can't even make it all the way here gets called a hero? It's totally ridiculous. So, I don't think I'm the one to blame here. How you may ask? Well, by this argument from theory. I'm super smart. Subaru, as you can see, this woman's not smart at all. At first, I'd suspected that she may have actually forgotten, but that's not the case. Reason being that the Shala from this problem isn't this woman in the first place. Shala, I am the only Shala. I got this name from Master. Subaru, even the name that your master gave you came from someone else. He prodded out his finger to the tip of the protesting Shala's nose and pushed her away before she could get closer. Following that, Subaru walked over to the original monolith and stood in front of it. Emilia, maybe once again, only Subaru knows the origins of Shala's name? Subaru, it isn't just me who knows, though I suppose not everyone would know. The name of a star in my hometown is called Shala. The meaning of its name is the stinger, but if I had to specify which kind of stinger, then it'd be the scorpion stinger. Shala had insisted on calling her hairstyle a scorpion tail. Had that been a hint of some sorts, or was that some natural airheadness of Shala's? Whichever one it was, there'd been a few things that had made him recall that Shala equals scorpion equals stinger. Subaru, according to legend, the hero Orion was stung by a scorpion which had been sent out to besiege him due to his boastfulness, and he ended up dying. After his death, he became a star. So, the scorpion that killed Orion also became a star due to its deed, and it's said that even now in the sky Orion lives in fear of the scorpion. Beatrice, now that you've explained things, this legend has a pretty depressing vibe to it too, in fact. Subaru, anyways, think of it as having constellations where stars are illustrated by the figures of animals and people and such. You can even think of them as an asterism. So, that's how it looks when you look down on the monoliths from above. Becoming practically weightless as a result of Beatrice's magic, he jumped up and looked down at the group of monoliths. The scattered black monoliths in this world of white, although their colors were inverted, a series of black stars floated about in this white world, forming a pattern which he was familiar with. There were 8 monoliths in total which had the same size as the original one. The number of major stars as well as how they were laid out both matched with how the constellation of Orion was shaped. And when he linked it to the last part, touched the brightest. Subaru, the original monolith is right in the middle. Well, I just gotta keep my eye on Elnalam, and if I keep following the shape of the constellation. If I keep following Orion then. Emilia, then? Subaru, the phrasing the brightest is a bit of a roguish expression. In actual fact, stars shine in various different ways, sometimes they're always bright, other times they shine brighter only every so often. Considering that, there are 2 stars that fit the bill for the brightest in Orion. When viewed from above, the 2 stars that fit the bill were the right shoulder of Orion located in the upper left part, Betelgeuse, and Orion's left knee located in the lower right part, Rigel. Rigel was always invariably bright, whereas Betelgeuse was a variable star that sometimes shone brighter than Rigel. Solving the problem by picking both of them wasn't a pretty one, but... Subaru, I guess I'll go for Rigel. He had bad memories of a name that was similar to Betelgeuse. Subaru. Setting his answer in stone, Subaru touched the monolith on Orion's left knee, Rigel. This wasn't necessarily the only answer. But most likely it should be the right one. And at the same time he realized that, he readied himself for the precipitousness and difficulty of the obstacles that awaited them on the second and first floor, when considering the maliciousness of the person who'd cooked up these trials. Subaru. The white room was filled with a dazzling light. Both sound and landscape were left behind, everything was blown away, before finally. Subaru, whoa. When the light died down, Subaru and the others were left standing in a room made out of stone in the middle of a room that was encompassed by countless bookshelves. End of chapters 21 and 22, The Monolith Challenge.